It has often appeared to me, in looking back over the singular series of adventures which I shared with my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, that the smallest and most transient impressions were those upon which his genius delighted to fasten. A smudge upon a cuff, the smell of a chemical, the twist of a bootlace. Such trifling matters, dismissed by common men, became under his scrutiny the starting points of the gravest discoveries. Yet of all those apparently insignificant phenomena, none was stranger than the dancing shadow of candlelight upon a wallpaper in the house of a dead man. For it was that wavering patch of illumination which first traced, as it were, the outline of a crime that had confounded both family and police alike. It was in the late autumn of '89, as nearly as I can recall, that the affair of the candlelight map, so I have come to think of it, was brought to our notice. London lay under a chilly, persistent drizzle, and the lamps in Baker Street projected only ghostly cones upon the glistening pavement. Within, however, our rooms were filled with that peculiar atmosphere which seemed to gather around Holmes when his mind was engaged. Tobacco haze wavering in the lamplight, the gleam of chemical glassware upon the table, and the rustle of newspapers which he had strewn over the floor in a semicircle around his chair. Holmes lay at length upon the sofa, his long, spare figure coiled like that of some great cat at rest, his eyes half closed, the thin, eager face turned toward the fire. Between his fingers he held his pipe, from which a blue spiral mounted toward the ceiling. I had brought back with me a medical journal of some interest and was endeavoring to concentrate upon an article on tropical fevers, but the familiar sight of my companion in such an attitude of apparent indolence, which I knew masked an intense, inward activity, drew my eyes more often to him than to the page before me. "You have mislaid your stethoscope again, Watson?" he remarked languidly, without opening his eyes. I looked up in some surprise. "Not at all. It is in my bag." "On the contrary," said he, "it is in the pocket of your old overcoat, which you left hanging in the surgery at Kensington this morning." "And how in the world—" Holmes permitted himself the ghost of a smile. "You returned here without your bag," he continued. "Mrs. Hudson handed it to you 10 minutes after your arrival, having received it from the boy who runs between your practice and Baker Street." "You apologized for troubling her. Clearly, then, you went to the surgery without it. Yet you were summoned to a patient with chest complaints yesterday evening, for you mentioned as much at breakfast. You would never visit such a case without your instrument. You came back last night with the bag, but went out early this morning without it, since you did not ring for hot water as you usually do when preparing for a full day. Ergo, you left the stethoscope in the very coat which you assumed you would be using again. The boy brought only the bag." I could not repress a laugh. "You make my very absent-mindedness a matter of logical necessity." "My dear fellow," said Holmes, "if men were not so fond of calling their own carelessness by charitable names, I should be deprived of 3/4 of my livelihood." Whatever reply I might have made was cut short by the sound of wheels upon the street below, followed by the sharp peal of our doorbell. The steps that mounted the stair were quick and impatient, and in another moment Mrs. Hudson ushered into our sitting-room a gentleman whose whole appearance proclaimed him to be deeply agitated. He was a man perhaps in his late 30s, though anxiety had traced lines upon his forehead which made him appear older. His dress was that of a prosperous merchant, sober but of good material. His sandy hair was disordered, as if he had passed his hand through it repeatedly, and his gloves, which he crushed in one clenched fist, bore the marks of recent rain. His eyes travelled rapidly from me to Holmes, in whom they seemed to find at once the object of their search. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice unsteady. "My name," said my companion, rising languidly from the sofa and indicating a chair. "Pray be seated, sir. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. You may speak as freely before him as before myself." The newcomer bowed slightly in my direction and sank into the proffered chair, though he perched upon its edge, as a man might who is poised between flight and collapse. "My name is Percival Ashcroft," he said. "I was the junior partner in the firm of Carstairs and Ashcroft, shipowners and exporters, with offices in Fenchurch Street and a house in Cadogan Place. I have come to you, Mr. Holmes, because a most dreadful event has occurred, one which the police can make nothing of, and which, God help me, already casts its shadow upon my own reputation." Holmes had resumed his seat, but was now leaning forward, his long fingers steepled, the grey eyes sharpening upon our visitor's face. "You spoke in the past tense of your partnership, Mr. Ashcroft," he observed. "I infer that your senior partner is the victim of this dreadful event." "You infer correctly, sir. Mr. Lionel Carstairs is dead. He was found this morning in his library, under circumstances so extraordinary that I scarcely know how to lay them before you." "Calmly, and in order, if you please," said Holmes. "Begin with the condition of affairs before his death. Was he a man with enemies?" Ashcroft hesitated. "In business, perhaps," he said slowly. "In our line there are always rival houses who would gladly see us fail. But as to personal enemies, no, Mr. Holmes, I should not have thought it. He was a hard man, but just and well respected in the city. He had no family, save a nephew who resides with him, and a distant cousin, who is also his ward." Holmes inclined his head. "We will come to the connections presently. For the moment, let us have the facts. At what hour was Mr. Carstairs last seen alive, and by whom?" Ashcroft drew a breath, collecting himself, and I drew my notebook from my pocket, for long habit had taught me that every such recital under Holmes's roof might prove of importance. "Mr. Carstairs entertained a small party at dinner last night," said our visitor. "There were 5 of us, Mr. Carstairs himself, his nephew, Mr. Arthur Carstairs, his ward, Miss Edith Vale, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, whom you may know." Holmes's lips twitched. "We have some acquaintance." "And myself. The inspector was there on social terms. He and Mr. Carstairs had become friendly of late, through a charitable committee on which they both served. We dined at 7. Afterward, the ladies, Miss Vale was the only lady present, retired to the drawing-room. We 3 remained over our wine and cigars for perhaps half an hour. Then Arthur proposed a rubber of whist. Mr. Carstairs declined, saying that he had papers to examine in his library. He left us at about 5 minutes to 9. "You are precise, Mr. Ashcroft," said Holmes. "I happen to have looked at the clock, sir. Arthur and I played 2 rubbers while the inspector joined us. At about 10, Miss Vale retired. Lestrade left shortly after 11. I remained talking with Arthur in the drawing-room until past. At that time we parted. I took my leave and walked home." "And your senior partner remained unaccounted for all this while?" "He had the habit, sir, of working late in his library, sometimes until 1 or 2 in the morning. It was not unusual for him to deny himself to callers if he were engaged upon figures. He disliked disturbance when so employed. The servants knew better than to intrude upon him unless called." Holmes nodded. "And in the morning?" "In the morning," said Ashcroft, and his voice shook. "His housemaid, going to draw up the blinds in the library at 7:30, found the door locked. She knocked, and receiving no answer, supposed he had already gone out. It was Miss Vale who grew uneasy when he did not appear at breakfast. At 9 o'clock she insisted that the door be opened. The butler fetched a spare key." "And they found him?" "Lying upon the carpet near his writing table. Quite dead, Mr. Holmes. The police surgeon believes he died somewhere between 11 and 1 o'clock. There was a contusion upon the back of his head, as from a blow. The window was fastened on the inside. The only door was the one which had been locked. There is no other entrance to the room. "A locked room affair, Watson," murmured Holmes with a sidelong glance at me. "Pray continue, Mr. Ashcroft. You spoke of extraordinary circumstances." "Yes, sir. The first is that nothing appears to have been taken. His watch and chain lay upon the table. A cash box in the lower drawer had not been forced, and there was money in it, more than £20. Papers were scattered, but not, so far as I can tell, with any object. It looks less like robbery than murder for its own sake." "Or for a motive not immediately visible," said Holmes. "And the second circumstance?" Ashcroft passed a trembling hand over his brow. "It is the thing that no one can explain, Mr. Holmes. On the wall opposite the writing table, above the fireplace, is a large space of plain paper, for Mr. Carstairs had lately stripped the room of some old prints. When they entered the room this morning, they found that space illuminated by a most peculiar patch of light, though the shutters were closed and the morning was dull. A candle had burned low upon the mantelpiece. From that candle, through some trick of reflection or refraction, there fell upon the wall a pattern of light and shadow so distinct that even Lestrade could not but remark upon it." Holmes's eyes were shining now. "A pattern, you say? Of what character?" Ashcroft made a helpless gesture. "It is absurd, and yet I cannot call it otherwise. It resembled a sort of map, Mr. Holmes. Not a map such as you would find in an atlas, but a rude tracing of lines and angles like streets upon a plan. There was even a curved streak that might have stood for a river. It flickered and wavered with the guttering of the candle, yet the general outline was unmistakable. Lestrade called it a shadow picture, and would have thought no more of it. But Miss Vale cried out that she had seen something like it once before." "Ah," said Holmes softly. "Where and when?" "In that very room, sir. Some weeks ago Mr. Carstairs had been working late. Miss Vale, passing along the corridor, noticed a curious glimmer through the crack under the door. She looked in, thinking he might have fainted. She saw upon the wall the same strange configuration of light and shadow. Mr. Carstairs, seeing her, was greatly irritated. He told her sharply never to enter his library without knocking, and he hastily snuffed the candle. Holmes had sunk back in his chair, his lids drooping over his keen eyes, but I knew that this attitude betokened the most intense attention. "You will perceive, Mr. Holmes," Ashcroft went on, "that this inexplicable apparition has taken on a sinister significance now that he is dead. Lestrade declares it to be the mere accident of a candle set near a glass ornament and a decanter upon the mantel. He says that if we knew in what street that shadow map lay, we should doubtless find a public house in it, and so dismiss the matter altogether. But I cannot dismiss it. Nor can I silence the whispers that have already begun, that Mr. Carstairs was engaged in some secret transaction, that he had enemies unknown to us, that this sign upon the wall, was some sort of signal or mark between him and others." Holmes' fingers opened and closed once upon the arm of his chair. "Who has seen this phenomenon besides yourself, Miss Vale, and Lestrade?" "The household, sir, and I fear the constables who came when the alarm was given." "People talk." "Already there are rumours of a ghost map in Cadogan Place. It is unendurable, Mr. Holmes, and that is not all." "There is more?" Ashcroft leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Before we parted last night, Mr. Carstairs spoke a few words to me which now ring in my ears. He touched upon certain matters in the firm, matters of accounts and consignments, which he said he wished to review. 'Tomorrow, Ashcroft,' he said, 'we shall go over everything together. I fancy there are one or two items which may surprise you.' He smiled as he spoke. It was the last time I saw him alive. Do you not see how it stands? If there are any irregularities in the books, if there is the least hint of speculation or mismanagement, public suspicion will fall first upon me, the junior partner. Already Lestrade has asked me questions, and his tone—" The unfortunate man broke off, his composure giving way for an instant. "I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I am as ignorant as a child of any cause that might have led to this dreadful event." Holmes rose and began to pace slowly up and down the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his head inclined. I knew that, to his mind, the pieces of the puzzle were already arranging themselves into some tentative pattern. "You did perfectly in coming to me at once, Mr. Ashcroft," he said at length. "I gather that Inspector Lestrade is in charge of the case?" "Yes, sir," he said, rather reluctantly, I thought. "That advice from you might be useful if you could spare the time." Holmes's lip curved. "Lestrade is a very brave man when it comes to facing burglars, but he is even braver when it comes to facing his own limitations. I shall go to Cadogan Place at once." "You will take the case, then?" cried Ashcroft. "My dear sir, the combination of a locked room, a dead ship owner, and a candle that draws maps upon the wall would tempt a quieter man than myself," said Holmes. "Doctor, your hat." "We may find that our damp London morning conceals a rather more interesting geography than that upon any printed chart." As we descended the stairs in the wake of our agitated client, I glanced at Holmes's face. There was a light in his eyes which I had learned to associate with those problems most worthy of his powers. Whatever enigma lay behind the strange play of candlelight in the library of Lionel Carstairs, I knew that, before long, that flicker on the wall would be subjected to the full, clear beam of Sherlock Holmes's reasoning. We found a cab without difficulty, for though the weather was wretched, London was already astir with the traffic of the business day. Holmes flung himself into the far corner, his chin upon his breast, and his long legs doubled beneath him in that ungainly fashion which I had so often observed when his mind was engaged. I could see from the fixed abstraction of his gaze that he was already turning over in that remarkable brain of his the scanty facts which Ashcroft had placed at our disposal. "You noted, Watson," he said suddenly without looking up, "that Mr. Ashcroft spoke of rumours already circulating among the servants and constables?" "Yes. He mentioned a ghost map." "Precisely. A vulgar mind confronted with an unusual impression leaps at once to the supernatural. A trained mind asks, by what natural means has this unusual impression been produced? It is the difference between hysteria and science. When we reach Cadogan Place, I shall hope to meet less of the former and to introduce a little of the latter." Our client gave a faint, mirthless smile. "If you can silence these whispers, Mr. Holmes, you will do me an additional service." Holmes inclined his head, but vouchsafed no reply. The cab rattled over the wet stones, turning westward into the more fashionable quarter. Presently we swung into a broad, orderly square, where sober houses of brick and stone, uniform in height and aspect, looked down with a certain reserved dignity upon the passing world. At one of these, its knocker tied with a strip of crape, the driver drew up. A police constable stood at the door. He saluted Ashcroft and eyed us with curiosity as we entered. The hall within was spacious and plainly furnished, with a wide staircase rising to the upper floors. At its foot, a man in sober black, whose grey hair and impassive features proclaimed him a butler of the old school, came forward to meet us. "Mr. Ashcroft, sir? Inspector Lestrade is in the library." "Very good, Pringle. This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson." The man's eyes rested respectfully upon my companion, in whose features I saw him recognize a name that had already travelled far beyond Baker Street. "If you please, gentlemen," said he. "This way." We followed him along a corridor, thickly carpeted, to a door at the farther end. Outside it, upon a narrow table, lay a silver tray with some letters, a pair of gloves, and a walking stick. The butler paused, his hand on the knob. "The inspector desired that nothing be touched, sir," he remarked to Ashcroft. "Inspector Lestrade," came a familiar, dry voice from within, "desires also that Mr. Sherlock Holmes should not be left standing in the passage. Let them in, man, let them in." Pringle opened the door, and we passed into the library of Lionel Carstairs. It was a long, somewhat narrow room with a high ceiling and shelves of dark wood lining the walls on either side. A large writing table stood toward the window end, with a leather chair behind it. The single tall window looked upon the back of the house. Its shutters, painted white, were at present thrown open, admitting a dull grey light. Nearer the fireplace, on the right-hand wall as we entered, a broad expanse of wallpaper was visible where pictures had lately been removed. Above the mantel itself were arranged a number of objects: a small mirror in a carved frame, a cut-glass decanter half full of some amber liquid, a glass bowl containing marbles or pebbles, a silver candlestick with a long guttered taper, and several smaller ornaments, such as men delight to collect without knowing precisely why. Inspector Lestrade, a wiry little figure with his thin face and ferret eyes, stood near the writing table, making a few notes in his battered pocketbook. He slipped it away as we approached. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said he, with that air of mingled deference and self-assertion which I had seen in him on more than one occasion, "you've come to have a look, then? I suppose I mustn't complain. A locked room and a dead man are enough to tempt any amateur." "Professional, Lestrade," said Holmes pleasantly. "You and I ply our trades in different fashions, that is all. You have made your preliminary examination?" "I have, and the divisional surgeon with me," returned the inspector. "There's the body. Not much to puzzle about there." Holmes' gaze had already passed to the still figure stretched upon the floor. Lionel Carstairs lay upon his face between the writing table and the fireplace, his arms slightly bent under him, his head turned a little to one side. His dress was that of the previous evening, a dark frock coat, waistcoat, and trousers of sober cloth. The back of his head, just above the right ear, was discoloured and swollen, and a small clot of dried blood had matted the greying hair. Holmes dropped upon one knee beside the corpse, his movements as lithe and precise as those of a trained surgeon. I, too, bent down, and together we examined the wound. "A single blow delivered with considerable force," I observed. "From a blunt instrument, probably metallic. The bone is depressed." "Quite so, doctor," said Lestrade. "The surgeon puts the time of death at between 11 and 1 o'clock this morning. The man was in fair health, no sign of apoplexy or heart disease. The blow did the business." Holmes did not reply. He had taken the dead man's wrist between his fingers and was studying the nails with an absorption which to a stranger might have seemed fantastic. Then he examined the cuffs and the front of the coat, finally passing his hand lightly over the shoulders and down the spine, as though to assure himself there was no other injury. Rising, he cast a slow, sweeping glance around the room. "You are satisfied, Lestrade," said he quietly, "that Mr. Carstairs could not have fallen and struck his head by accident?" "There's nothing here for him to strike it on," retorted the inspector. "The edges of the table and fireplace are smooth enough. Besides, the angle is wrong. No, Mr. Holmes, someone gave him that crack, and pretty neatly, too." Holmes's eyes travelled from the body to the writing table. It was strewn with papers, some neatly arranged in piles, others scattered here and there as if brushed aside. A cash box stood open in one corner with notes and coins still in their compartments. Upon a blotting pad lay a letter, the pen beside it, its nib dried and clogged with ink. Holmes bent over it. "Ah," he murmured. "You have read this, Lestrade?" "I have." "It's to you, Mr. Ashcroft," he added, turning to our client. "Seems your late partner was in the middle of it when something interrupted him." I stepped forward and read the few lines over Holmes's shoulder. The handwriting, in a firm commercial script, ran thus. "Dear Ashcroft, I have been turning over the figures in the Eastern shipments, and I am more than ever convinced that there is a discrepancy which must be explained. Tomorrow morning we shall go into the lead—" There it broke off abruptly, the final word trailing into an inky scrawl. "The surgeon was of opinion that the blow was delivered while he was seated at the table," Lestrade remarked. "He may have looked round at the sound of a step and got it then. Anyway, the pen drops, the letter stops, and that's the last he wrote." Holmes straightened himself, his face quite expressionless. "And the door?" "Locked on the inside. The key was in it." "That's the door you came through. The window, as you see, was shuttered last night and still closed when they broke in this morning. No marks on it, no sign of forcing. The chimney is too narrow for Father Christmas, let alone a murderer. So there you are, Mr. Holmes, a room sealed as tight as any strong-box and a dead man inside it." "A fascinating combination," said Holmes softly. "You have removed nothing, Lestrade?" "Nothing at all. I've just noted what was there and where. You'll find the room as it was found, bar the position of the body. They turned him over at first, thinking he might still be alive." Holmes's gaze had shifted now to the fireplace and the wall above it. His whole manner altered. I recognized the quickened breathing and slight brightening of the eye, which betokened a point of special interest. "Ah," he said, "and here we have your shadow map." The wallpaper was of a pale, neutral pattern, upon which there was at present nothing unusual. Yet as Holmes spoke, a faint draught stirred the curtains. The light from the grey window faltered, and I noticed that a second candlestick stood upon a small side table, as though recently used. Holmes glanced at it, then at the bell pull near the door. "The room was as dark as a pocket last night, I take it?" he remarked. "Black as your hat by 11 o'clock, said Lestrade. "The shutters were closed before the servants went up. They were found still bolted this morning when we forced the door." "Yet there was enough illumination for Miss Vale to see this."
"Curious phenomenon you spoke of, Mr. Ashcroft," Holmes went on. Ashcroft stepped forward, his face still drawn. "It was brighter then, sir. The candle was longer. The light fell in a queer, patchy way upon the wall, making something like a plan. This morning it was faint, but still traceable till Lestrade opened the shutters fully." Holmes's eyes travelled to the mantelpiece. He regarded the arrangement of objects with a concentrated scrutiny which took in each detail: the angle of the small mirror, the position of the decanter, the glass bowl with its variegated pebbles, the guttered candle in its silver stand, and a little crystal paperweight which stood close to the base of the mirror. "Have any of these things been moved since the discovery?" he asked sharply. Pringle, the butler, who had hovered respectfully in the doorway, answered at once, "No, sir, not so much as a finger's breadth by the inspector's orders." "Very good." Holmes's voice was brisk and businesslike. "Doctor, oblige me by drawing the curtains and closing the shutters, Lestrade, if you will be good enough to light that candle on the mantel. Mr. Ashcroft, I should like you to stand exactly where Miss Vale stood when she first observed this apparition." In a few moments the room was plunged into a dim, enclosed dusk, relieved only by the yellow gleam of the candle flame. As my eyes accustomed themselves to the change, I became aware of a strange effect upon the wall above the fireplace. The light, passing through the crystal and reflected from the little mirror and the curved surface of the decanter, broke and spread into a network of faint, shimmering lines,
They overlapped and intersected in a fashion that, as Ashcroft had said, suggested the plan of some district of streets. One broken curve, more luminous than the rest, ran across it like a river through a town. "Remarkable," I whispered involuntarily. Lestrade gave a low chuckle. "A pretty parlour trick, that's all. I've seen worse in a music hall." Holmes paid no heed. He had stepped back till his shoulders almost touched the opposite wall, his head thrust forward like that of a bird. Then, with a swift movement, he drew a notebook from his pocket and began to make a rapid, exact sketch of the pattern before us. "Do not stir the candle," he said sharply, as Lestrade shifted his weight. "The slightest alteration will distort the whole." For some minutes there was no sound, save the faint scratching of his pencil and the soft guttering of the taper. Then he snapped the notebook shut. "Thank you, gentlemen. You may admit the daylight again." When the shutters were thrown open and the grey morning streamed once more into the library, the mysterious chart vanished as completely as if it had never been. Holmes slipped his notebook into his pocket and turned to Lestrade. "You are quite right, Inspector, that this is a natural effect, and that the stage magician could easily produce a more startling spectacle, yet like many simple things it may have a significance which is not simple. Tell me, has anyone recognized in this pattern a resemblance to any known locality?" "No, sir," said Ashcroft. "Miss Vale spoke only of having seen it once before, but Mr. Carstairs himself, he seemed disturbed when she mentioned it. He snuffed the candle and told her sharply to leave him." Exactly. Holmes's eyes had that faraway look which told me that his mind was already travelling beyond the walls of the library. A man does not conceal a mere optical accident unless it is connected in his mind with something he desires to keep hidden. We may take it, then, that this shadow map, as we shall call it for convenience, is associated in some fashion with the business which occupied Lionel Carstairs of late. And that business, we know, concerned a discrepancy in his Eastern shipments. He paced once the length of the room and back, pausing for an instant beside the writing table. His hand hovered over the open cash box, the scattered papers, the unfinished letter. "Very good," he said at last. "You have done well not to disturb anything, Lestrade. I shall now examine the rest of the house, beginning with the approaches to this room. After that, I should like to have some conversation with Mr. Arthur Carstairs and Miss Vale. There is much here that is clear and more that is obscure. When we have heard what they can tell us, I fancy we shall see our way a little farther along this singular map, which the candle has traced for us." Holmes motioned for us to follow him into the corridor, leaving Lestrade to direct a constable to stand guard over the library. The moment we stepped into the passage, Holmes's manner changed. He became quick, silent, and intensely observant, his gaze sweeping the skirting boards, the carpet pile, the hinges of the door, and the shadows cast by the stairwell lamp. I had often seen him thus, like a hound picking up a scent invisible to all but himself. He knelt suddenly, touching the carpet just outside the threshold of the library. "Look here, Watson," he murmured, tapping a faint depression in the nap. "A footprint, but not from the boots the servants wear. Note how narrow the sole is and how the heel is sharply cut. A gentleman's shoe, but not of English make unless I am greatly mistaken." Ashcroft leaned over my shoulder. "It may be Arthur's. He wears a slender last." "So slender," Holmes replied quietly. "And was Arthur Carstairs abroad recently?" "Abroad? No, certainly not within the last year." "Then these are not his." Holmes rose. "They are too sharp, too delicate in contour. Continental workmanship, perhaps French, possibly Italian. A curious thing to find in a locked-room murder, is it not?" Ashcroft swallowed. "But how could such a print be here? The door was locked, the window closed. Precisely why the question is of such interest, Holmes returned. Let us see whether the corridor reveals anything further. We proceeded along it, Holmes pausing now and again to examine a slight irregularity in the runners or the faint discoloration upon a panel of woodwork. At length we reached a small alcove near the foot of the staircase where a side table stood bearing a single decorative vase. Holmes stopped short. "Ha! Another fragment added to our mosaic." He pointed to the floor. "Do you observe the tiny chips of dried wax here? They are not from the candle in the library. The colour differs subtly. This is a different beeswax entirely. Someone has stood in this very spot with a lit taper at least once, possibly more, and long enough for several droplets to fall." Ashcroft stared in bewilderment. What on earth would anyone want with a candle in the hallway? "That," Holmes replied, "is what we shall endeavour to discover. But you see, Watson, this case grows more curious by the minute. A map of unknown streets thrown upon a library wall, a second candle burned here, footprints not belonging to anyone presently accounted for. What, pray, unites these disparate elements?" I knew better than to answer. Holmes was not posing the question to elicit speculation. He was thinking aloud in order to fit the strange pieces together. He turned abruptly and ascended the stairs, 2 steps at a time, Ashcroft and I following in his wake. On the first landing stood a tall young man whose pallor and reddened eyes bespoke a night spent in grief and anxiety. This was Arthur Carstairs. He looked at us searchingly as we approached. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, his voice subdued. "My name," Holmes said gently. "You must forgive us if we seem abrupt. Circumstances demand haste. I wish to ask you a few questions, and later I shall trouble you to accompany us to the library." Arthur inclined his head. "I will help as I can. Miss Vale is in her room. She's terribly shaken. In time, I shall speak with her as well. For the moment, tell me, did your uncle lock his library door every night?" Arthur hesitated. "Not every night. Only when he worked on private papers. Last night I cannot say, for I did not see him again after 11. "And in the days leading up to this?" Holmes pressed. "Did he behave in any way unusual, grow secretive, receive strange correspondence?" "There was something," Arthur said slowly, "but I hardly know whether it has any bearing on his death." "Everything has bearing," Holmes murmured. "Even the smallest trifle. Pray continue." Arthur's eyes flicked toward Ashcroft with an expression of faint embarrassment. "My uncle was a strict man, and he disliked intrusion into his business affairs. But 3 nights ago, as I passed the library door, I heard voices. One was his, sharp, irritated. The other was a man's voice, low and foreign-sounding. I could not make out the words." Ashcroft gave a startled exclamation. "Foreign? But who—" Holmes raised a hand. "You did not recognize the other voice?" "No," Arthur admitted. "I listened only an instant. When I stepped closer, the conversation stopped abruptly. Then I heard the sound of a chair scraping as if someone had risen. I moved away at once, not wishing to intrude. A moment later the door opened and my uncle called out sharply, asking if anyone was in the corridor. I answered, and he said nothing further, only shut the door again." Holmes' expression grew very intent. "And did you see the visitor leave afterward?" "I did not," Arthur replied. "I remained in my room the rest of the evening." Holmes tapped his finger lightly upon the banister. "Interesting. A foreign voice, a candle burned in the hall, and an unfamiliar continental footprint outside the door. A consistent pattern begins to emerge." I felt a stir of excitement. "You believe the same man returned last night?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "My dear Watson, I believe he never left the house at all, at least not by the front door, but we shall verify that shortly. Arthur, has anything gone missing from your uncle's private papers? Any documents that you or Miss Vale recall seeing previously? I cannot say, but Miss Vale might know. She was sometimes entrusted with the correspondence. Then let us speak with her. We were led to a quiet room at the end of the landing. Miss Edith Vale sat near the window, pale and composed, though her hands trembled slightly as she rose to greet us. She was a young woman of delicate build, with dark hair gathered neatly at her neck. Her eyes, though reddened, held an intelligent steadiness that surprised me. Holmes bowed slightly. Miss Vale, I regret to disturb you at such a moment, but your assistance is of the highest value. I will tell you anything I can, she said softly. Mr. Carstairs was good to me. I wish to see justice done. Holmes drew a chair forward and seated himself opposite her. Miss Vale, when last you saw the phenomenon upon the library wall, the shadow map, did Mr. Carstairs display fear, anger, unease? She pressed a hand lightly to her temple, recalling. Unease? Yes. He seemed alarmed that I had seen it. He told me sharply not to mention it, and he extinguished the candle at once. There was something in his face, something I had never seen before, almost as though he feared the map itself. Feared it, Holmes repeated. Excellent. And one more question. Did your guardian ever receive letters marked with foreign stamps or in unfamiliar handwriting? Yes, she said immediately. Within the last fortnight, there were 2 such letters. He took them without allowing Pringle to place them upon the hall table. I noticed only because he kept them in the inner pocket of his coat for several days. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Thank you, Miss Vale. You have given us more than you know. He rose then, and I noted the tension in his features, the excitement of a man who glimpses the outline of a hidden truth. As we stepped back into the corridor, Holmes's voice dropped so low that only I and Ashcroft could hear him. This foreign visitor of 3 nights ago, he murmured, whose footsteps we find in the corridor and whose presence Carstairs sought to hide, played a significant role last night. But how does one enter a locked room without unlocking the door? That, Watson, is the question which must be answered before the next stroke of this sinister business falls. He turned sharply toward Lestrade's voice, calling from below. Come, gentlemen, the house has not yet yielded its final secret, and time is no friend to the careless. Holmes descended the staircase with such purpose that I was obliged to lengthen my stride to keep beside him. The house, though hushed in mourning, seemed to echo faintly with the tension gathering in each room. The servants whispering in corners, Lestrade's occasional sharp commands, Ashcroft pacing distractedly near the drawing-room door. Holmes's mind, however, moved with a swiftness and precision that rendered all external agitation irrelevant. He searched only for the next thread in the pattern. We found Lestrade in the vestibule, peering irritably through the glass panes of the front door. There you are, he said, turning toward Holmes. I was just about to send for you. I've ordered the constables to question the neighbours, but so far nobody saw any visitor enter this house late last night. Holmes gave a slight nod, as though this confirmed something rather than contradicted it. Quite so. The man we seek is not one who arrives by ordinary means. Lestrade snorted. Unless he flew in through the chimney, he came by the hall or the window, and both were secured. Or appeared to be secured, Holmes corrected mildly. Observation, not assumption, is our business. Let us revisit the front entrance. He stepped into the small space between the door and the hat stand, his gaze travelling from the lock to the hinges, then upward to the transom window above. With a small exclamation he reached up, touching the narrow ledge where dust should naturally have gathered. "Watson, hand me your penknife." I obeyed, and Holmes scraped lightly along the ledge. A fine trail of dust drifted away, but not uniformly. A distinct streak showed as a clean line across part of the surface. "Something has been placed here recently," he murmured. Something long and narrow, perhaps a small rod or tool, rested upon this ledge. And this, yes, notice the faint mark on the side of the frame. A metal instrument is pressed here. Lestrade frowned. "Well, people set walking sticks and umbrellas against the wall every day. That proves nothing." "I fear you misinterpret what you see," Holmes replied. "Umbrellas do not reach this height, nor do they slide in such a way. No, someone performed a deliberate action here. The transom is hinged. Watson, try to lift it." I rose on tiptoe, pressed my fingers against the edge, and found, to my surprise, that the transom yielded slightly when I applied pressure. "It's loose," I said. "Not fully latched?" "Precisely," Holmes murmured. "Someone, from within or without, has manipulated this window. And note the angle. It opens inward. A man outside could reach a slender arm through, unlock the door from within, and enter without ever disturbing the main bolts." Lestrade looked unconvinced. "But that would require the man to stand on something. The door's too high." Holmes gestured to the iron boot scraper embedded in the front step. "A small man, or a man with agile footing, could manage it. Especially one accustomed to climbing narrow structures, say a sailor or a street performer. But come, we must not remain here theorizing. There is more to learn elsewhere." Ashcroft approached, pale but attentive. "Mr. Holmes, does this mean someone entered the house while we were all here last night?" Holmes's answer was quiet. "I believe someone entered this house before Mr. Carstairs dismissed you from the drawing room and remained inside after you left." A cold stillness fell over us as he spoke. Ashcroft shivered. Lestrade uttered a low whistle. "But why?" I asked. "To steal papers? To commit murder? Or both?" Holmes gave me a brief, approving glance. "A good question, Watson, and one we shall shortly answer. But to the heart of the matter, we must examine the servants' stairs. Whoever our intruder was, he would not risk the principal staircase while the household was awake." We followed him through the corridor to a plain door near the pantry. It opened on a narrow flight of steps, steep and enclosed, with scuffed boards and a dim lamp swinging from an iron bracket. Holmes knelt again, this time holding his magnifying lens to the tread. The beam of light from the lamp trembled as he angled it. "Ah, just as I hoped. Look here, embedded in the grain, a flake of dark grease mixed with soot, and here, half a footprint, small and angled, consistent with the one outside the library." Ashcroft gasped. "The same foreign shoe!" "Indeed," Holmes confirmed. "Our intruder moved through this passage. And note, there is a slight smudge upon the wall at shoulder height. He brushed against it." Lestrade bent close. "So he used the servants' stairs, but none of the staff saw him." Holmes shook his head. "Not surprising. A man who enters by stealth chooses his moment carefully. Tell me, Lestrade, have you questioned the kitchen staff? Did any retire early? Any door left unlocked below?" "I questioned them," Lestrade muttered. "They swear the back entrance was bolted." "And yet someone passed this way," Holmes said softly. "Someone both agile and determined." He straightened, his eyes sharpening. "I think it time we speak to Mary the housemaid." Pringle, summoned by Ashcroft, brought the young woman forward. She was small, fair-haired, and trembling with distress. "Mary," Holmes said kindly, "you unlocked the library door this morning." Yes, sir," she whispered. "I knocked, but he didn't answer. Miss Vale said to fetch the spare key." "You noticed nothing unusual? No sound?" No smell of smoke or candle? She hesitated. The candle on the mantel. It was burned nearly to the holder. More than usual, sir, and she twisted her hands. And there was something else. I didn't think it mattered. Holmes's expression sharpened. Tell me. Well, it was the back stair landing. When I went down at dawn to fetch kindling, I thought I saw... I'm not sure, but I thought I saw the pantry door closing, just a flicker like someone moved it. But when I looked, nothing was there. The door was ajar, that's all. Holmes' entire posture stilled, as though some inner puzzle had clicked a fraction closer to completion. Mary, he asked softly, what time was this? Just after 6, sir. Holmes exchanged a swift look with me. And the body was found at 7:30. So our intruder may have still been inside the house only an hour before the discovery. Lestrade swore under his breath. Ashcroft looked ready to faint. Holmes' voice took on a calm, collected firmness. Gentlemen, our visitor was no ghost. He was flesh and blood. He entered through the transom, moved through the servants' stair, confronted or surprised Lionel Carstairs in the library, and after the deed was done, hid himself until dawn. But where? I asked quietly. Holmes's eyes gleamed. That is precisely what we must determine next. A man cannot vanish utterly from a house unless he hides where no one thinks to look. He turned toward the kitchen wing with purposeful steps, and the tension in the air grew sharper still. Come, Watson, he said. We are about to search for a living shadow. Holmes moved ahead of us with swift, noiseless steps, his long coat brushing the narrow passage walls as we entered the kitchen wing. The air here was cooler, scented faintly with soap, damp stone, and the lingering traces of last night's supper. The servants had withdrawn at Lestrade's instruction, leaving the scullery and pantry in an unnatural silence. Holmes paused just inside the doorway, raising his head as a hound might before choosing a trail. Notice, Watson, he murmured. No lingering smell of pipe smoke, spirits, or sweat. Indications that a man slept here. Yet Mary's account strongly suggests the presence of someone at dawn. He stepped into the pantry. Shelves of tinned goods, sacks of flour tied neatly at the neck, a stack of folded aprons, and the large ice chest. Nothing seemed out of place. Lestrade
Followed, his gaze skeptical. If the fellow hid in here, he left no sign of it. Holmes turned sharply. On the contrary, there is one sign that leaps to the eye. Both Lestrade and I scanned the room, yet nothing caught my attention. Holmes did not wait for us to puzzle over it. Instead, he strode to the ice chest and lifted the heavy wooden lid. A cloud of chilled vapor escaped, revealing the ice block stacked within. He touched the edge of the lid, examining the brass hinge. "Feel here," he instructed. I laid my fingers on the metal and found it faintly warm. Lestrade raised his brows. "Warm, but the chest was closed." "Which means it was opened very recently," Holmes replied. "Within the last hour, or the chill would have returned. And note, there is no food missing, nor any unusual item within. Therefore, someone lifted the lid, but did not intend to store or retrieve anything." Ashcroft paled. "Do you mean he climbed into that dreadful box?" Holmes shook his head. "Impossible. The interior is too shallow. No, he opened it for another reason, likely to check whether it might conceal him, or to ensure the room was clear before slipping out." "But where did he hide, then?" I asked. Holmes's eyes travelled slowly to the floor-level cupboard beneath the pantry shelves. He crouched and tugged gently at the door. It opened grudgingly with a wooden groan. Inside was an empty cavity barely wide enough for a man to curl himself into. Crumbs of bread and dust clung to its edges. "This," Holmes said, "is where our visitor hid, a cramped, wretched arrangement.
but a desperate man would prefer discomfort to discovery. Lestrade peered in. "I'll admit, a small fellow might fit. But why hide here? Why not escape immediately after the deed?" "Because," Holmes answered, "Arthur Carstairs and Mr. Ashcroft were awake downstairs until 11:30. Miss Vale did not retire until 10. Servants moved about until at least that hour. A man exiting by the front would risk detection. If he went to the rear, he would meet the staff. No, the safest course was to remain concealed until dawn provided a quieter moment. Holmes rose, suddenly dusting off his knees. "Watson, look to the handle of this cupboard." I bent closer. The small brass knob was smeared with the faintest trace of soot. "And there," Holmes continued, pointing to the skirting along the wall, "a thread of dark wool caught upon a splinter, not from any garment Miss Vale or the servants wear. No, the fabric is coarse, foreign." Ashcroft swallowed audibly. So the intruder did hide in this very pantry. But why linger till dawn? Why risk discovery by Mary? Holmes paced the small space, hands behind him, eyes half-lidded, because he had not yet obtained what he came for. A hush fell. Lestrade stiffened. "You think he returned to the library after the murder?" "I think he intended to. Whether he succeeded, we shall determine soon." Holmes moved back through the doorway into the servants' hall. His gaze swept upward to the small window above the sink, a casement-style opening with an iron latch. "Watson," he said softly, "do you see what I see?" The latch hung not fully down, but resting at an angle, a subtle but unnatural slant. Holmes stepped beneath it, running his finger along the sill. "Dust disturbed, faint scuffing here. Our visitor left the house through this window." Lestrade blinked. "At dawn? But that faces the neighbour's garden. Anyone might have seen him." "Possibly, but he chose his moment well. Dawn light is tricky. The human eye does not easily distinguish detail then. And note that the earth below is soft from last night's rain. A landing would leave a print." We all hurried outside through the back door, rounding the corner to stand beneath the window. Holmes knelt, brushing the wet soil. "There," he whispered. A single footprint, a narrow-soled shoe pointed at the toe, the same as the one outside the library. "Good heavens," I murmured. Holmes rose slowly, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, inward clarity. Now the sequence becomes unmistakable. A foreign man, small and agile, entered before the household slept. He hid in the pantry. At some hour between 11 and 1, he confronted Lionel Carstairs in the library. There was a struggle. The blow fell. The man waited, listening until dawn offered him his one safe escape. Lestrade wiped his brow. "But why did he come in the first place? And what has all this to do with that blasted candle map on the wall?" Holmes's expression hardened. "Everything! And until we determine the meaning of that strange projection, we cannot hope to name the murderer." Ashcroft, visibly shaken, steadied himself on the garden bench. "Mr. Holmes, I cannot bear the thought that my partner died for some secret he held alone." Holmes regarded him keenly. "Your partner was engaged in something far more complex than a mere accounting discrepancy. The foreign visitor, the hidden letters, the map formed of reflected candlelight. They suggest a design, one we must decipher." He paused, then turned abruptly toward the house. "We have exhausted what the lower floors can tell us. Now, Watson, we return to the library. I must examine the desk more closely, particularly the papers Mr. Carstairs refused to share. Somewhere in those sheets lies the reason for this midnight intrusion." As we re-entered the silent corridors, Holmes walked with renewed urgency, his coat flaring behind him like the wings of some dark bird. "Watson," he said, as we mounted the last step, I believe Lionel Carstairs discovered something dangerous enough to cost him his life. And before this day ends, we shall know precisely what that something was. But as we reached the library door, Holmes stopped abruptly, for the faint smell of smoke drifted beneath it, fresh, sharp, undeniable. Lestrade looked startled. "But we ordered the room sealed. No one should be inside." Holmes' gaze sharpened to a point. "Then someone is inside." And without waiting for permission or explanation, he flung open the door. Lestrade uttered a sharp curse and pushed forward, but Holmes was already inside, his tall figure cutting a swift path between the table and the fireplace. The air in the room was tinged with a faint, acrid haze, not enough to obscure the view, but unmistakable enough to suggest that some object had only moments earlier been burned. Though no one stood within the room now, the sense of recent presence clung to the air like a shiver. "The smell is fresh," Holmes said softly. "Very fresh. Watson, close the door behind us. Lestrade, do not allow anyone to enter until I give the word." I obeyed, and the latch clicked into place. Holmes moved with the precision of a man dissecting both silence and space, his eyes narrowing as they swept the desk, the hearth, and the carpet around the body's former position. His hand lifted slightly, as though testing currents in the room. "Someone was here within the last 2 or 3 minutes," he murmured. "Perhaps less." Lestrade stepped forward, colour rising to his cheeks. "Then they must still be in the house. My men are posted at every exit. Someone must have slipped past them." Holmes crouched near the fireplace, his eyes darting across the grate. Small flakes of blackened ash clung to the metal guard, and a few unburned edges of paper lay curled on the hearthstone. "Here," he said quietly. "It is what our visitor came for." He lifted the unburned scrap between his fingertips. Even from where I stood, I could see the fine, ruled line that once bordered a business ledger, the remnant of a column of figures. Only a corner remained, but it was enough to indicate that something had indeed been destroyed. Ashcroft, who had followed us as far as the threshold, stepped forward with visible distress. That was a page from our accounts." "He burned it." "Someone burned it just now." Holmes held up a hand to steady him. "Control yourself, Mr. Ashcroft. Panic will help nothing. The question is not merely what was destroyed, but why." He returned to the grate, carefully extracting with a pair of tongs another half-charred fragment. This one bore a smear of ink which might once have been handwriting. "Most of it is lost," he observed, "but the corner suggests it belonged to a smaller sheet, likely a personal note or memorandum, something Carstairs had set aside separately from the other documents." Lestrade was pacing now in agitation. "But how in blazes did anyone get in here? The constable outside swears no one passed." "Then they did not pass the constable," Holmes replied calmly. "Which leaves 2 possibilities. Either the man was already inside the house when we stepped out, or he entered by a means the constable did not see." Ashcroft stared, bewildered. "Entered? But the windows—" "Show no sign of disturbance." "Yes," Holmes said, "and were likely untouched. But the transom above the front door is not the only aperture a determined man might employ. There is also the possibility of—" He broke off abruptly, his keen gaze catching something near the writing table. Moving at once to the far side of the desk, he stooped to retrieve a tiny object from the carpet. He held it in his palm for us to see, a minute length of black thread, coarse and fibrous. "The same origin as the thread found in the pantry," he murmured. "Our visitor has been here." Lestrade made another agitated turn about the room. "Then he must still be in the house. I'll have the place searched from attic to coal cellar." "You may do so," Holmes replied, "but you will not find him.
He has already departed." Lestrade stopped short. "Departed? How the devil do you know that?" "The smoke," Holmes answered simply. "Had the man fled before the paper was burned, the smell would not linger so strongly, and had he remained longer, the smoke would have spread farther, grown denser. No, he slipped away while we walked from the garden to the library. A matter of less than a minute." Ashcroft's voice trembled with dread. "Then he cannot have come far. Which exit did he use?" Holmes's eyes flicked to the closed shutters, then to the door we had entered. Slowly he strode to the corner near the bookcases where a tall velvet curtain draped one narrow panel of wood. With a single sweeping motion, he drew the curtain aside and revealed a narrow service door hidden behind it. Ashcroft gave a cry of astonishment. Lestrade swore aloud. I myself felt a jolt. Holmes tested the handle. "Unlocked," he said softly. "This, gentlemen, is how our visitor entered and departed. The servants doubtless assumed it always locked, perhaps never even used it. A man who knew this house well, or had been shown its peculiarities, could readily slip through this passage." He opened the door to reveal a cramped, dark corridor, no wider than a man's shoulders, which ran behind the wall of the library and branched toward the rear of the house. "He is gone," Holmes said, "but not without leaving clues behind him." Lestrade, regaining his composure, barked orders to the constable outside, dispatching him to search the side yard and alley. Holmes, however, no longer concerned himself with pursuit. Instead, he closed the door and returned to the desk. "This intrusion tells us something crucial," he said. "Someone feared what Carstairs had written or discovered. Someone who returned at considerable risk to ensure those papers did not fall into the wrong hands." "Whose hands?" I asked. "Mine, Watson," Holmes replied with quiet certainty. "Or possibly Mr. Ashcroft's. Lionel Carstairs, we must remember, was a man on the verge of exposing a serious discrepancy in his business affairs. Someone feared that exposure enough to kill him, and enough to return in daylight to destroy the evidence." Ashcroft's face had drained of all colour. "Mr. Holmes, I swear to you I know nothing of these discrepancies." Holmes nodded once. "Your sincerity does you credit, but sincerity alone will not shield you. Whoever orchestrated this business will gladly allow suspicion to fall on you if it serves their purpose." He leaned over the desk, examining each page with fastidious attention. At last he tapped a sheet bearing a faint watermark. "Here, Watson," he said quietly. This letter, addressed but unsent, was folded among the others. "It concerns the Eastern shipments Carstairs wished to examine. And this symbol, do you see, a small triangular flourish at the top of the watermark. French, I believe, and common among certain merchant houses whose dealings do not always stand the light of day." Lestrade peered over my shoulder. "And you think our intruder serves them?" Holmes's voice was calm but deadly sure. "I think our intruder is tied to them in the most intimate manner. This letter, this watermark, this foreign shoe print, this stranger's voice heard by Arthur, these are pieces of a single puzzle, and when we discover the street map cast by that candlelight, we shall know precisely where that puzzle leads." He stood up, slipping the paper into his pocket. "Gentlemen," he said, "the time has come to follow the map." And with that he strode from the room, his eyes glittering with the light that meant a revelation lay close, dangerously close, before us. Holmes swept down the corridor with such purposeful strides that neither Lestrade nor I dared interrupt him. Ashcroft followed in a daze, wringing his hands, his breathing shallow with anxiety. The very air of the house seemed charged now, as though the walls themselves braced for the next revelation Holmes intended to tear from them.
When we reached the drawing room, Holmes halted abruptly, pulling his notebook from his coat. He flipped to the page on which he had sketched the shadow map, the strange tangle of luminous lines cast upon the library wall. Holding it up to the window light, he studied it with an intensity that made even the usually imperturbable Lestrade stand silent. "Watson," he murmured, "what do you make of this curve here, the one that resembles a river?" I leaned in. The line, though uneven due to the distortion of candlelight and crystal refraction, did indeed suggest a waterway bending through a street grid. "It could be the Thames," I said cautiously. Holmes gave a thin smile. "Just so, and here, a cluster of intersecting lines resembling narrow lanes. This, to my eye, resembles a district in the East End, but more significantly, this triangular piece here," he tapped a sharp angle on the sketch. "It matches the triangular watermark on the letter Carstairs received." Ashcroft blinked. "You mean the map was not random, not a trick of the candle, but a reference, an intentional sign?" "Precisely," Holmes said. "Someone used the curios upon the mantel to create a projected map, but the arrangement is too elaborate to be accidental. It suggests that Carstairs had been studying this quarter, or someone had wished him to do so. Now consider that the watermark on the foreign correspondence matches the same region." Lestrade frowned deeply. "A foreign merchant house operating in the East End? Smuggling? Fraud?" Holmes turned sharply. "More specific than that. A small syndicate dealing in illicit opium or smuggled silk might choose such a location. But this," he tapped the paper again, "this map is unlike any simple navigational aid. The lines align with a very particular part of Wapping, a region of warehouses, abandoned yards, and, if memory serves, of the old Krell dock." I started. Krell dock had been abandoned for nearly 20 years, the timbers rotting, the warehouses converted to cheap lodgings or left to gather rats. "You believe Carstairs discovered something occurring there?" I asked. Holmes closed the notebook. "I believe he was lured there, or threatened to be silent about what he learned. The foreign visitor who came 3 nights ago likely pressed him for documents. Carstairs resisted. He examined the shipments and uncovered the truth. The man returned last night and killed him." Ashcroft shook violently. "But who could operate such a ring? And why involve our firm?" Holmes looked at him steadily. "I hope for your sake, Mr. Ashcroft, that your partner was coerced rather than complicit. That remains to be seen." Ashcroft's face twisted with hurt. "I swear to you, we are honest traders. If anything was concealed, it was from me." Holmes nodded, but reserved judgment. "We must now verify where the map leads." Lestrade stepped forward. "You mean to go to Wapping? Immediately?" "Immediately," Holmes replied, "before our quarry slips farther from reach." Holmes reached for his coat and hat with fluid certainty. "Time presses. Watson, bring your revolver. And Lestrade, if you value this investigation, bring 2 constables, quiet men, the sort who can follow without being noticed." Lestrade grumbled, but it was the grumbling of obedience. He strode off to arrange the men. Ashcroft clutched the back of a chair. I should come with you, should I not?" Holmes's answer was gentle but firm. "No, you are a possible target, Mr. Ashcroft, and if the murderer learns we suspect Krell Dock, he may return for you. Stay here under guard." Ashcroft nodded faintly, pale as chalk. Holmes signalled for me to follow him out into the hallway, away from the ears of the shaken merchant. "Watson," he whispered, his voice taut, "there is more to this than Ashcroft guesses. Someone inside that house aided the intruder, knowingly or not. The hidden door behind the curtain, no stranger would discover it so quickly without guidance." I stared. "You believe one of the household was involved?" Holmes raised a hand. Hush! I believe someone knew more than they admitted, not necessarily a villain, but someone who suppressed a detail. It could be Miss Vale, Arthur, or even the butler, but the answer will be found at Krell Dock. That is where this mystery began, and where it must end. Before I could reply, Lestrade reappeared with 2 sturdy constables at his heels. "The cab is ready," he announced. Holmes nodded and strode out into the misty street. The drizzle had begun anew, thin and steady, laying a sheen over the pavement. As we climbed into the hansom, Holmes tapped twice on the roof, and the horse lurched forward, turning toward the river. The city grew grimmer as we drove east. Grand avenues gave way to narrow streets, then to lanes choked with soot, darkened buildings. The smell of the Thames, cold, brackish, crept in through the slats. Holmes sat motionless, but I could see the keen anticipation in his eyes. He had that peculiar stillness that preceded moments of revelation, as if every sinew of his being were attuned to the deduction forming silently within him. At last the cab turned onto a desolate stretch of cobblestone. The buildings thinned, replaced by looming brick warehouses with boarded windows. Fog hung low over the ground, swirling around heaps of discarded rope and broken crates. "This is it," Lestrade muttered, pulling his coat tighter. "Krell Dock." We disembarked. The constables followed, alert and tense. The only sounds were the distant lap of water against rotted timber and the wind threading itself through the empty yards. Holmes walked ahead, his long strides sure despite the uneven stones. He consulted his sketch once, then pointed to a narrow lane between 2 derelict warehouses. "This way." The map indicated this precise fork. We followed him down the lane. It led to a sagging gate half hidden behind a broken cart. Holmes pushed lightly. The gate creaked open with a groan. Beyond it lay a wide courtyard strewn with debris. A single warehouse stood at the far end, its doors chained, its windows shattered. Holmes looked up sharply. "There!" he whispered. "The window on the upper level, a faint movement." Lestrade stiffened. "I saw it too. Someone's inside." Holmes turned, his voice low, urgent. "Watson, Lestrade, ready yourselves. What we find in that building may reveal the heart of this conspiracy." He moved swiftly across the courtyard, each footfall deliberate on the damp stones. The fog thickened, curling about us as though to muffle our approach. Holmes's hand closed around the chain on the warehouse door. He tugged it once, it rattled faintly. Then, from overhead, a single piece of rubble dislodged and fell with a soft clatter. Holmes lifted his gaze, and his eyes flashed. "He knows we're here," he breathed, "and he is not alone." Holmes did not hesitate. The instant the rubble struck the ground, he pivoted sharply toward the side of the warehouse, his movements swift and precise. Lestrade barked an order to his constables, who drew revolvers and fanned out across the courtyard. The fog seemed to thicken in anticipation, swirling around the broken crates as though to conceal both hunter and hunted. "Watson, stay close," Holmes murmured, already advancing toward a narrow external staircase of rusted iron bolted to the warehouse wall. It led to the very window where we had glimpsed movement. "But the door," I began. "Locked, chained, and watched," Holmes replied briskly. "Our quarry would never exit where we expect him. Up!" We ascended the creaking steps as silently as our boots allowed. Halfway up, Holmes froze, raising a hand. A faint, shuffling noise drifted from inside the warehouse, slow, deliberate, not the random scurry of an animal. Someone was moving cautiously, perhaps repositioning themselves after being sighted. Lestrade's voice reached us from below. "Shall we force the main door?" "No!" Holmes called softly down. "You will drive him toward us. Keep your men ready. No shots unless absolutely necessary. The man is dangerous, but he may yet be persuaded to talk." Holmes resumed the climb, and I followed, my hand instinctively moving to the revolver in my coat. The staircase groaned beneath our weight, each sound magnified in the fog-laden stillness. At the top, a small landing ended at a broken window frame. Holmes leaned in, examining the jagged glass. "Fresh," he murmured. "The breakage is recent. The shards on the sill still cling to moisture. They have not yet dried. Our visitor forced entry here." He motioned for me to lift myself through the gap first, an instruction I obeyed reluctantly but without question. The interior was dim, dust-filled, and echoing with an eerie hollowness. My boots sank slightly into grime and rotted sawdust. Holmes followed in one fluid motion, landing beside me soundlessly. He straightened, tilting his head. "We are not alone," he breathed. "Keep your revolver ready, but do not fire unless I give the word." I nodded, my heartbeat loud in my own ears. Ahead stretched a vast, empty floor, broken only by the silhouettes of crates, long-rolled carpets, and sagging beams. A single shaft of grey light streamed through the broken upper windows, cutting across the gloom like a blade. Holmes pointed to the far corner. "There, footprints." I squinted. Indeed, faint though they were, dotted impressions marked the dust where someone had moved rapidly. The prints were narrow-soled, with a pointed toe, the same foreign shoe that had left its mark outside Carstairs' library. Holmes allowed himself a quiet, triumphant breath. He led us exactly where he feared we would come. We advanced, along the line of prints, stepping lightly to avoid disturbing their pattern. Then abruptly they ended near a stack of crates. Holmes crouched. He doubled back. He pointed to faint scuffs leading toward a shadowed alcove beneath a timber platform. As our eyes adjusted, the outline of a man became visible, crouched in partial concealment, head bent low, one hand clutching a small leather satchel. He had not heard us, not yet. Holmes rose slowly, lifting one hand in a calming gesture. "Do not move," he said softly. The man jerked, startled, and sprang to his feet. He was slender, short in stature, with olive skin and dark, sharp eyes. His clothing was simple but foreign, an unbuttoned coat of rough wool, a dark scarf wound about his neck. He glanced between Holmes and me like a cornered animal. For a moment I thought he might leap past us. Instead, he backed further into the shadows, gripping the satchel more tightly. Holmes took one measured step forward. "You have been watched since dawn. The exits are covered. You cannot escape now without bloodshed, your own or another's. Let us speak instead. It will go better for you." The man shook his head violently, muttering something in French, rapid, panicked, unintelligible to my ear. He raised a hand as though to warn us back. Holmes, however, switched languages without pause. His French was fluid and confident. "Nous ne voulons pas vous blesser," he said. "We do not wish to harm you." At the sound, the man hesitated, but only for a heartbeat. Then, with a sudden cry, he turned and bolted toward the opposite end of the platform, aiming for a stairwell that descended to the ground level. Holmes was after him in an instant. I followed, the boards groaning beneath our pursuit. The man reached the staircase and half slid, half ran down it. Holmes leapt the last few feet, landing just behind him. The man darted left, straight toward a boarded-up doorway leading to the courtyard. Lestrade's constables were visible through its gaps, shadows shifting beyond. "Stop him!" I shouted. The man raised his arm as if to shield his face, and then something slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floorboards near Holmes's feet. The leather satchel. Holmes did not pause. With the swiftness of a cobra strike, he lunged forward, catching the man by the wrist. The fugitive twisted, trying to break free, but Holmes's grip held unyieldingly. Lestrade's men burst in from below, their boots thudding like a drum. Within seconds the man was surrounded. He sagged in defeat, panting heavily. Holmes released him only when the constables took hold of his arms. Lestrade, breathless from running, stormed in from the courtyard entrance. "Well done, Holmes. We got him." Holmes didn't answer. His attention was fixed upon the satchel lying on the floor. He stooped, examining it without touching. "Watson," he said quietly, "note the emblem on the clasp." I knelt beside him. The clasp bore a familiar symbol, small, triangular, identical to the watermark on the letter Carstairs had kept hidden. Holmes lifted the satchel with utmost care, his face grim. "This," he murmured, "is what our murderer sought so desperately to retrieve at Carstairs' house. And what Carstairs discovered, too late, was worth killing to conceal." Lestrade gestured impatiently. "Well then, what's inside it?" Holmes straightened slowly. "That, Inspector," he said, "is a question we must answer in controlled circumstances, not here, not now." He turned to the captured man, whose eyes followed the satchel with terror. "For this man," Holmes continued in a low voice, "is not the architect of the crime. He is a frightened pawn, one who fears the people truly behind this conspiracy far more than he fears us." The man flinched visibly. Holmes stepped closer to him, his voice soft but piercing. "Take him to Scotland Yard, under guard. He may yet speak if he survives the night." Lestrade stiffened. "If he survives?" Holmes nodded grimly. "This web reaches deeper than even Carstairs understood, and those who wove it will not hesitate to silence anyone who knows their design." He lifted the satchel. "We must move swiftly, Watson, before they realize this man has failed, and before they come for the evidence now in our hands." With that, Holmes strode out of the warehouse, the fog swallowing his outline as though ushering us toward the next peril awaiting in the shadows. Holmes strode ahead through the fog with such speed that I had to lengthen my steps to keep pace. The constables remained behind with Lestrade to escort the captured man, leaving only the two of us moving toward the main road that bordered Krell Dock. Holmes clutched the satchel tightly beneath his coat, shielding it from sight. "This must be opened in Baker Street," he said in a low, controlled tone. "Not here, not under the eyes of any curious soul." "You fear it contains something dangerous?" "I fear," Holmes replied, "that it contains the truth." We hailed a cab, and Holmes gave the driver our familiar address. Only when we had settled inside the rattling hansom did I see the faint tremor in Holmes's right hand, the only outward sign of the intensity of thought running through him. The fog wrapped around the cab wheels, swallowing sound and leaving only the rhythmic clatter of hoofbeats. Holmes leaned his head back, eyes half closed. "The man we apprehended," he murmured, "is not a killer by nature. His fear was genuine, palpable. He is a courier, Watson, a runner, the kind used by small but dangerous syndicates to convey coded messages or illicit goods. He was sent to recover whatever Carstairs had uncovered, and to prevent us from learning its contents." "And the murder?" I asked. Holmes exhaled slowly. Another hand delivered the killing blow. The courier's slight stature, his lack of bruises, the absence of blood on his coat all suggest he was not the attacker. But he was in the house that night, hidden, waiting. His task was to retrieve the documents once the deed was done. But the murderer himself? "Not yet known," Holmes admitted, "but we are close, very close. And I suspect the true culprit is a figure of some standing, someone who believed Carstairs would not be missed if he fell during the chaos of a supposed robbery or accident. He fell silent for the remainder of the journey, turning the triangular symbol satchel over once between his palms before tucking it back inside his coat. When at last we arrived at Baker Street, Holmes bounded up the steps and into our sitting room with an energy that belied the damp gloom outside. He lit the lamp, closed the curtains, and gestured for me to lock the door. "Now," he said, placing the satchel on the table, "let us see what secret moved a foreign agent to risk discovery and a murderer to stain his hands." The satchel's clasp opened with a soft click. Inside was a bundle of papers, thin, creased, and tied with string. Holmes untied them and began sorting through the pages. I leaned over, noting the strange symbols, columns of figures, and unfamiliar merchant seals. "These," Holmes said, spreading several pages before us, "are bills of lading, shipping manifests from Carstairs and Ashcroft. But look closer, these marks here and here." He pointed to sets of small, triangular stamps, each with a slightly different flourish. These denote specific cargo items, but the cargo described does not match the declared content. The manifests claim shipments of tea, silk, and spices, but the marks correspond to something else entirely. "What?" I breathed. Holmes tapped the page. "Guns, Watson! Firearms! Smuggled into London aboard the firm's ships." A chill crept down my spine. "But Carstairs was an honest man," Ashcroft insisted. "Carstairs may indeed have been honest," Holmes said, "which is precisely why he was killed. He discovered that someone had inserted altered manifests, someone who had access to his company's documentation and could manipulate shipments at the dock." I stared at the papers. "You believe the murderer is tied to the company?" Holmes nodded once. "Deeply. And this courier was retrieving the incriminating manifests." He sifted deeper into the satchel and drew out a small notebook, bound in faded blue cloth. Inside were names, dates, and coded references. At the very back, a page written in French caught Holmes's eye. He translated aloud, "If he speaks, all is lost. The Englishman must be silenced before he makes contact. The young one will not suspect." My breath caught. "The young one, Arthur Carstairs?" "No," Holmes said quietly. "The wording is deliberate. The young one will not suspect refers to someone who stands to gain or lose in the aftermath of Carstairs' death." He closed the notebook slowly, his gaze burning with realization. "Watson," he said, "this syndicate has an English accomplice inside the Carstairs household. Someone who guided the courier, who knew the hidden door in the library, who knew Carstairs' habits, and who would be believed implicitly." My mind raced. "You suspect, Arthur?" Holmes shook his head. "Arthur is too guileless, too open. No, my thoughts turn elsewhere. Someone intelligent, composed with access to correspondence." He looked at me significantly. "Miss Vale?" Holmes lifted the blue notebook, tapping the French script. "The courier's instructions describe a person Carstairs trusted implicitly, someone who handled his letters, someone who could remove or replace documents without attracting suspicion." "But Miss Vale adored Carstairs," I protested. "Her grief was genuine." "Perhaps," Holmes said softly. "Or perhaps she grieved not for him, but for the danger she herself now faces." Before I could reply, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Holmes stiffened instantly. "No one must know we are here," he whispered. But the knock came again, sharper, urgent. Holmes motioned for me to stand back and moved silently to the door. "Who is there?" he demanded. A trembling voice answered from the other side. "Mr. Holmes, it is Miss Vale. Please, may I speak with you? I am in terrible danger." Holmes and I exchanged a single glance. Holmes opened the door just enough to admit her. She stumbled inside, pale and wide-eyed, her cloak soaked through with rain. "They know," she whispered. "They know the satchel is gone. They know it is with you." Holmes steadied her by the shoulders. "Miss Vale, who knows?" Her answer came in a shaking breath. "Arthur's cousin, Lionel's ward, Edmund Vale. He is not what you think. He is the one who met the foreign men. Oh, Mr. Holmes, he plans to flee tonight. He said I must keep silent, or I will not live to see the morning." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Watson," he said with sudden, icy clarity, "our net has closed around the true culprit." Miss Vale pressed her hands to her mouth, trembling. "He knows I'm here," she whispered. "He followed me, and he's armed." Holmes reached for his revolver. "Then we must act swiftly," he said, "for the murderer has realized he is cornered, and a cornered man is at his most dangerous." Holmes motioned Miss Vale toward the far side of the room, placing her behind the armchair as though it were a barricade. She obeyed numbly, trembling so violently that her cloak slipped from her shoulders and pooled onto the carpet. Holmes stepped to the window, drew the curtains a finger's breadth apart, and peered into the fog-drowned street below. "Watson," he murmured without turning his head, "do you see the carriage at the corner? The one with its lantern dimmed?" I joined him. There it stood, half veiled by mist, a hansom cab with its roof drawn low, its silhouette too still, too deliberate. Inside its shadow sat the faint outline of a man. "Yes," I whispered, "someone is watching." Holmes nodded grimly. "Edmund Vale. He seeks to ensure that Miss Vale does not betray him, and if she does, to silence her before dawn." Miss Vale's breath caught audibly. Holmes lowered the curtain and faced her fully. "You were right to come. You are safe now, but time is not our ally." Holmes crossed the room with a controlled urgency, unlocking the drawer of his writing desk. From it he withdrew a second revolver, which he handed to me. "We must depart Baker Street at once," he said. "The satchel contains the documents that will condemn Edmund Vale and his associates. He will not leave them in our possession. The moment he confirms Miss Vale's presence here, he will strike." "But where do we go?" I asked. "Back to Cadogan Place," Holmes replied. "We must confront Edmund Vale on familiar ground where his confidence will betray him, and before he destroys the remaining evidence." Miss Vale clutched the back of the chair. "He is dangerous, Mr. Holmes. He has friends, men who answer to him without question." "Criminals often mistake fear for loyalty," Holmes answered. "It is their greatest weakness." He extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into semi-darkness. "We leave by the back alley. Watson, you will escort Miss Vale. Keep her close. Do not draw attention unless absolutely necessary. I will take the lead." We descended the stairs as quietly as shadows. Mrs. Hudson, hearing our movement, cracked her door, but Holmes raised a hand, silently begging her trust. She retreated without a sound. The kitchen door opened onto the narrow yard behind Baker Street, where the darkness was thick enough to hide 3 fleeing figures. Holmes paused at the threshold. "Go quickly, but keep low. The fog is our ally tonight." We slipped into the alley. Holmes led with astonishing swiftness, guiding us through a maze of back lanes and mews passages. Twice he halted abruptly, listening with that preternatural sensitivity of his, then redirected us before any pursuit could catch our trace. At last we reached the broader thoroughfare where cabs passed intermittently. Holmes hailed one with a low whistle, the signal of a seasoned Londoner who wished to avoid attention. "To Sloane Street," he said to the driver, "and double your fare if you avoid the main roads." We climbed inside. Miss Vale pressed herself between Holmes and me, shivering uncontrollably. Holmes drew his cloak around her shoulders like a protective mantle. "You have suffered greatly," he said gently, "but your courage has brought us to the brink of ending this affair." She whispered, I never suspected Edmund, never. He was kind to me, or seemed to be. Lionel trusted him with everything. That trust, Holmes replied, was his undoing. The cab rattled forward. London's lamps glowed like distant embers through the fog, their halos quivering with each gust of wind. Holmes sat rigid, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Watson," he murmured, "when we reach the house, you will accompany Miss Vale to the drawing-room. Lock the door from inside and do not open it unless I call by name. Edmund Vale is armed. He will not hesitate to use force if cornered." "And you?" I asked. Holmes gave the faintest smile. "I shall present our friend with certain facts he will find difficult to refute." We reached Cadogan Place in fewer minutes than I anticipated, thanks to the driver's skill in avoiding the busiest arteries. Holmes paid him with quiet praise, then ushered us up the steps of the silent house. Inside, the butler Pringle appeared, startled by our sudden arrival, but Holmes silenced him with a swift motion. "Is Edmund Vale home?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Pringle stammered. "He returned not 15 minutes ago, said he had urgent business in the library." Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me. "The library," he said softly, "where Carstairs was killed." Miss Vale's breath hitched. Holmes addressed Pringle again. "You will do precisely as I say. Fetch Inspector Lestrade from Scotland Yard. Tell him Holmes requires immediate support at Cadogan Place, and say no more." Pringle, pale but obedient, hurried out into the night. Holmes placed a hand on my arm. "Now, Watson, take her to the drawing-room. Bolt the door." I nodded, guiding Miss Vale across the hall. Before I had even closed the door, Holmes was moving toward the library, silent as a phantom. I secured Miss Vale inside the drawing-room and pressed a finger to my lips. She sank onto the sofa, hands clasped tightly together. I wanted to reassure her, but the air was so thick with tension that no words came. Outside, the house seemed to hold its breath. A low murmur drifted from the corridor, Holmes's voice, calm and clipped. Then another voice answered, smooth, cold, unmistakably controlled. "Edmund Vale." Holmes's tone sharpened. "You were at Krell Dock tonight?" A pause. "I do not know what you mean." "You sent the courier. You destroyed the manifests, and you killed Lionel Carstairs when he learned of your smuggling operation." I moved to the drawing-room door, straining to listen without betraying our presence. Edmund chuckled softly. "You have an imaginative mind, Mr. Holmes, but you lack proof." Holmes's reply cut like steel. "Proof?" He dropped something heavy onto the library table, the satchel. "Is here?" A thud, a sharp intake of breath. Then Edmund's voice, low, venomous. "Then you leave me no choice." A sudden crash rang out, a chair overturned, the thud of boots, a scuffle. I flung open the drawing-room door despite Holmes's instruction, but Miss Vale seized my sleeve. "No, Watson, look." Holmes and Edmund were locked in a fierce struggle near the fireplace. Edmund's hand clutched a revolver, but Holmes held his wrist with iron precision, forcing the barrel skyward. "You forget," Holmes said between clenched teeth. "I anticipated this." Edmund snarled and tried to wrench free. The revolver fired once, shattering a framed print on the wall. Miss Vale screamed. I rushed forward, but Holmes shouted, "Stay back!" With a sudden twist of his body, Holmes drove Edmund backward against the mantel. The revolver clattered to the floor. Edmund struck Holmes across the jaw, but Holmes barely faltered. With a final, powerful blow, he pinned Edmund's arms and forced him to the ground. The door burst open as Lestrade and 2 constables rushed in. "In the devil's name, Holmes!" Holmes stepped back, breathing hard but composed. Edmund lay restrained beneath the constables, his expression twisted, not with fear, but with cold fury. Miss Vale appeared in the doorway, trembling. Holmes turned to her gently. It is over." Edmund spat bitterly. "Foolish girl, you've condemned us both." She recoiled, and Holmes stepped protectively between them. Lestrade snapped the cuffs shut. "Edmund Vale, you are under arrest for the murder of Lionel Carstairs and conspiracy to traffic illegal arms." Edmund struggled once more, then sagged in resignation as the constables hauled him upright. Holmes lifted the satchel from the table. "This," he said, "contains the entire operation's design. Carstairs uncovered it. That knowledge cost him his life." Miss Vale's eyes filled with tears. "And Oh, Mr. Holmes, I never suspected—" Holmes placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Guilt is a burden reserved for the guilty. You, Miss Vale, have shown remarkable courage." Lestrade led the prisoner out. The house fell silent, save for the settling crackle of the fire and Miss Vale's quiet sobs. Holmes turned slowly to me. "Watson," he said softly, "this affair proves once more that even the most innocent-seeming household may conceal a rot beneath its polished veneer." He exhaled, the tension easing from his shoulders. "But thanks to Miss Vale's bravery and your stout heart, we have managed to set the matter right." I clasped his arm. "Holmes, once again your insight has saved us all." He gave a faint smile. "Insight, Watson? Perhaps. But I would rather call it what it is. The map, drawn not by candlelight, but by human folly." He glanced toward the closed door through which Edmund Vale had been taken. "And now," he murmured, "the shadows have spoken their last." The dawn broke pale and washed out over London by the time Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the dripping rooftops and the faint glow of lamps extinguishing one by one as the city woke. Inside our rooms, the remnants of the long night's pursuit seemed to cling to the very air, the satchel with its incriminating papers resting upon the mantel, the faint scent of gunpowder from Edmund Vale's desperate struggle, and Miss Vale's abandoned cloak which Holmes had draped over the settee to dry. Holmes sank into his armchair with the weary grace of a man whose mind, though triumphant, had been stretched to its utmost limits. "You perceive, Watson," he said after a long silence, "that the case was never truly about a map of candlelight, nor even about the smuggling itself. It was a matter of human nature, of ambition, fear, and the oldest motive of all, greed." I settled opposite him. "And yet, Holmes, the intricacy of it, Edmund's involvement, the foreign courier, the hidden door, the shadow map, each piece seemed designed to mislead." Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. "Precisely. The murderer counted on confusion. Lionel Carstairs, however, was no fool. When he discovered the forged manifests and triangular symbols, he attempted to trace them back to their source. The crude map that Miss Vale saw was not a map at all, merely the chance projection of reflected light. But Carstairs mistook it for a design and rearranged the mantel objects deliberately to recreate the pattern. He believed it pointed to Krell Dock, and he was correct, though not for the reason he imagined. Then Edmund Vale seized upon that mistake? Just so. He encouraged it. He used the foreign courier to intimidate Carstairs, to retrieve any incriminating letters, and finally, when Carstairs refused to remain silent, Edmund resorted to the old and cowardly method of violence. Holmes rose and paced before the fireplace, warming his hands. "You see, Watson, Edmund did not need brilliance. He needed only the proximity afforded him by the household, his visits to the library, his control over the mail, his knowledge of Carstairs' habits. These provided him opportunity enough." I nodded slowly. "And Miss Vale?" Holmes's expression softened. "An unwilling pawn, she delivered letters to Carstairs without knowing what they contained. She saw the strange projection on the wall, but being the last person Edmund suspected of disloyalty, she was left alive until she learned enough to become dangerous. I remembered her trembling voice, her terrified confession at our door. Her courage saved her life. Holmes inclined his head. Indeed. Without her, the courier would have escaped with the satchel, and Edmund would have fled the country by morning. He paused, then added quietly, "It is a curious fact, Watson, that in matters of crime the faintest whisper of conscience often belongs to those most abused by circumstance." A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson ushered in Miss Vale herself. She appeared much calmer now, the first light of morning softening her features. She held her hands clasped tightly before her. "Mr. Holmes," she said gently, "Inspector Lestrade asked that I come to thank you and to collect my things from Cadogan Place before the house is turned over to the family solicitors." Holmes bowed slightly. "You are safe now, Miss Vale. Edmund Vale will answer for his crimes." Tears shimmered in her eyes. "I owe you more than I can ever say. You believed me when I feared no one else would." Holmes's voice was unusually gentle. "I believe